I want to talk about the importance of knowing and being known, or into me, you see, transparency, from a technical angle. Now, I've had a somewhat unique life, and in that uniqueness, there have been a variety of ways that I've been in extremes. And what extremes are good for is they break you out of the status quo and they give you two very different vantage points. So, just as one little example, traveling outside of the US to Europe, at a young age, I realized that the news is not the news. Because when I was in the US, here was the news. Then when I was in England, here was the news. And the global news was not the global news. Because British people are interested in certain world events that American people apparently are not. So it was puzzling. It's not the news. It's a certain filter of news. Similarly with language, there's differences between British and American spelling. Accents are different. All these things, you wake up and you realize everyone doesn't do this, which is the cult. You do it because everyone else is doing it, and that's as far as the analysis goes. So in these situations, like I first viewed England as an American, then I viewed England as British, and then I viewed America as a British person would. Then I moved to Canada and viewed Britain from a Canadian perspective and America from a Canadian perspective, and then moved to the US and viewed the US from the Canadian perspective and vice versa. And there's a pivot. Now, one's frame of reference, one's perspective, one's abilities, one's algorithms, one's programs, they are vital to engage. And one of the most interesting things that I've learned, because that's an easy one to talk about briefly, but there have been dozens and dozens of extreme cases where I'm on the outside of the norm on one extreme and then on the outside of the norm on the other extreme. And what's interesting to me is the mechanism by which a cult, our culture, tries to make sense of anomalous data. So some anomalous data just gets blocked out. That means we don't have to think about it. We don't have to look at the status quo. But a lot of it gets projected with the narrative of the dominant lens. There is a reason made up about why this or that isn't fitting the narrative. That does fit the narrative, because the narrative mind is the one that made up the reason. It's called projection. And what I always found fascinating was the amount of wasted energy that is and has been spent trying to project faulty reasons about why something is or is not knowing or is not happening, without actually knowing what the reason is from the other person's perspective. And I have found it remarkable that in my entire life traveling the globe, absolutely no one among tens of thousands of interactions, absolutely zero people on the planet today have asked me some of the most important questions necessary to attune, to understand who they're dealing with. So that's striking. But what's disturbing is that when I've asked them what story they've made up to fill in the void of the information they don't know and aren't asking about, that 90% of the time, the story they've made up to explain the data they don't have an answer for is completely wrong. It's worse than no data. And the very disturbing thing is that they believe the story they made up and don't see a need to fact check. Now, when you understand that this isn't personal, that this is a fractal pattern, that people look out through cult lenses and project the stereotypes of the cult, you realize that there is a tremendous amount of energy being wasted in human relationships with people who don't see clearly, who make up stories that lead to them seeing things worse, and that don't grasp that this is going on, and they believe the projection, and thus have the exact opposite impact they would like because of that scenario. Now, there's an obvious response to this, and it is to flood the relationship with data. That means intelligent questions, transparent answers, and quality time. If you flood a relationship with data, you squeeze out the projection, and you have a much higher quality, more data-based, effective relationship with a much smaller group of people. And you avoid a very common phenomena. I mean, it's so bad that I've interviewed 50 couples in the US, and they're right there sitting across from each other, and I'll ask one person a question. They'll answer it. And I'll ask the other person, did you know that? And the answer is no. So when married couples do not know and understand each other in key areas, the idea that the many intimate friends on Facebook, etc., would is preposterous. And so there's a real importance, there's a real value from a pragmatic point of view about knowing and being known and learning to attune based on data with a much smaller group of people. And I want to emphasize that there are 4 people in any relationship, or there are four presences in any relationship. There's my view of myself, there's your view of me, there's my view of you, and there's your view of you. And those 4 distinct patterns are in the relationship. Now, in a dysfunctional relationship, the way I see you has nothing to do with how you see yourself, and vice versa. The way you see me has nothing to do with the way I see myself, and vice versa. And there is no protocol for bringing those 4 signatures into attunement, or even to transparency, so that you know what I see about you and why I see that. And I know what you see about yourself and why you see that. And that those 4 distinct things come together into one awareness, one pattern. So that's a subtext. That's a paradigm for all of the videos on this channel.